Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So today we'll have the second part of worship as a spiritual practice. Last Sunday we saw the first part on this subject where we saw the purpose of worship, the important role it plays in providing an intermediate step between prayer and meditation. We saw the nature of worship last Sunday: sacrifice, adoration, sacredness, and we saw how the practice of worship helps us clarify our relationship with God. We also saw the spiritual benefits of worship. So these are some of the things we saw last week. And what we'll try to do today is to look at some of the basic principles of worship and also the general framework. Many of you have been coming to the Vedanta Center for many years, and I've also seen the worship that we do here. And also, of course, if you go to YouTube, pretty much everything you'll find there, and so many different kinds of worship and so on. It's helpful to understand. We know worship is a sacred practice, but if we understand even a little bit about what exactly are the principles behind it and what's exactly happening, even if we are not accustomed to doing worship ourselves, we can derive a greater benefit from that worship. And so today we'll start with some of the basic principles of worship. So there are at least 3 or 4 important principles which are important to remember. First is the power of invocation. That is the recognition that God responds to the earnest call of a devoted heart. That when there is a real longing in the heart, and the heart cries out in some way, some form, while it's fine to say God is everywhere and infinite, kind of a very impersonal, non-dual way of understanding God, which is fine, but sometimes in just intellectualizing everything, we may lose track of the experience that millions of earnest seekers of truth have had for centuries. That if there is a real longing in the heart, then in some way tangible to us, may not be tangible to everybody, but it's a very subjective experience oftentimes in many ways. But when there is this earnest longing and that intensity of love for God, there is some kind of a response we receive. And so the power of calling out to the divine, it's not simply faith. Yes, faith is important, but that intensification of that faith and calling to the divine receives a response, and it's important to recognize that. Even if we have not had it yet, to recognize that millions of earnest seekers of truth have had it all through centuries, and it can be a real possibility in our lives as well. The second principle, not actually the first one itself, about the power of invocation. When someone asked Holy Mother Sharda Devi that when we stand and pray before a picture of Ramakrishna, a picture of any deity for that matter, is the deity, is the divine present in some form in the symbol, in the altar, in whichever way we look at that presence of the divine? Is the divine really present, or it's something I just have to imagine? And what Holy Mother said was that if one stands before an image of the divine And here specifically she was referring to Sri Ramakrishna because that was the question. She said that God manifests in a special way through that symbol, through that image, through that photograph, whichever way we call out to the divine, that there is a real special manifestation of the divine in that way. So it's not, at some point we discover it's not simply subjective, it's not simply our imagination, that there is a real manifestation of the divine. And that recognition is important to keep in mind to understand the practice of worship. The second principle is what comes in the Upanishads. They call it the Yatha Kratu principle. And it's basically that what we think we become. That's the principle. There is a saying in Sanskrit, Yadrishi bhavana yasya siddhir bhavati tadrisha, which means as is one's thinking, so is one's success. And in the context of worship, it means here thinking really means awareness that we are in the presence of God. Worship as a spiritual practice, whichever form that worship might take, the more deep inside the heart we know that we are sitting in the presence of the divine. And oftentimes when we go to a place of worship, we go to a temple, a church, a synagogue, we're able to feel that. We may not be able to articulate exactly what or how it is, but somehow we feel different in a sacred space. And that recognition that, that the more I'm tuned to that divine presence, the more I will be able to feel that divine presence in my heart. So as is one's thinking, so is one's success. It really means the benefit of a worship will become more apparent to me the more I become aware of the presence of the divine wherever that worship is taking place. So the benefit of the worship will be experienced to the extent we can intensify the awareness of the presence of God. And a third principle is, again, a Sanskrit they say, Devo Bhutva Devam Yajet, which means worship the divine after recognizing your own divinity. Doing after being, so to speak. In other words, there is this, it's to kind of give a rather mundane example. We know that if there has to be some communication between two devices, then they have to be on the same platform. That's why those people, for instance, who use and that's just the commercial aspect of it. Some of these big technological companies try to keep you in their so-called, their own environment. So if you have one Apple device and you have another one, your two Apple devices will communicate with each other easily. But it's always difficult or almost impossible if you have an Apple device and then you have an Android something, and then for them to communicate become difficult because they're on two different platforms. Now, as I said, that's a very mundane example. But when we think about that we want to have an open channel of communication with the divine, then we have to be on the same platform, so to speak. The divine is divine, clearly, unless I discover I'm able to touch some spark of divinity in my own heart. Only then that communication channel is established clearly. I cannot be just a material being and then now trying to connect with the spiritual reality. So in order to connect with that reality, I have to discover that at least a spark of the divine, a little bit of the divine in my own heart. So a deification of the worshipper is an essential part before the deity can be worshipped. That's why it's called Devo Bhutva Devam Yajet. It becomes easier to worship the divine when we are able to feel the presence of the divine deep inside our own being. So these are the three principles. First, the power of invocation. Second, that what we think, that is what we become. And that's why we are often told from a very young age, think of good thoughts, have a lofty ideal. Because what our mind is engaged in, that is what it is in that direction our life will go. And sometimes they do also say that because the mind and the body are connected, that the way the mind is oriented, it has a way influence on the physical appearance of the person also. So when we look at some of these pictures of these or photos or whichever way their description comes, or some of these God realized souls, we see they may not oftentimes be beautiful in a conventional sense in which we measure beauty, but there is something about even the physical appearance of these God intoxicated souls. There is a certain clarity, there is a certain softness, showing that the mind really, the way the mind is shaped, the way what the mind thinks does influence the entire being or the personality of the person. So these three principles we have to keep in mind. It is possible to relate to God in many different ways, of course. But the way we do worship, especially at the Vedanta centers all over the world, we primarily see the deity as a divine guest. And so, just as when we have a special guest visiting our home, the welcome and hospitality that we accord to these guests, and that is the way the worship is generally structured. The clearly when we have guest visiting, and I'm sure there'll be many now that in the Thanksgiving time, and so while we welcome the guests and there is food and there is all these offerings are done, the same thing is done even in a worship, in a puja that we do at the Vedanta Center. The offerings are oftentimes very symbolical and are accompanied by appropriate Sanskrit mantras. But more important than the symbolical offering and the chanting of mantras is the focusing of the mind on God with love, devotion, and faith. It really would be pointless to have all these very elaborate offerings and then have very appropriate mantras being chanted, following all the rules of worship, but there is no love, there is no real devotion in the heart. So that's the primary ingredient in a worship, is once the sense of love and adoration. All of these things, when they are done properly, it helps to make God more real. Not God then, oftentimes, of course, in religious context, we use the word God so often. But sometimes it's helpful to pause and say, every time I speak about God or think about God, what is God to me really? Is God simply some kind of a hazy idea or some kind of a hope or a dream? Or is God a real being? When we look at our friends, when we look at our family, we look at the people around, we have no doubt these are real people. This is the real world, we keep saying. So when we look at the world and we think the world is real, we have to ask, when I speak about God, when I think about God, when I say I'm meditating on God, is God real in the sense the way I look at this world? So sometimes we might discover that for many of us, God is more an idea, a hope, or a dream, sometimes even just a concept. The sign that somehow we are progressing spiritually would mean that God does not remain simply an idea or a hope, not simply a matter of faith, not simply someone who I have to believe in, but then God becomes more and more real. At least in the beginning, at least as real as this world. But as we progress spiritually, we might discover that God is an even deeper reality, more real than everything that we have experienced so far in life. That's why the question which the young Vivekananda, as Narendranath, when he approached Ramakrishna and asked him, have you seen God? Of course, he began by saying, yes, I have seen God. But the second sentence, I'm always more intrigued by the second sentence. He says, I see God more clearly than I see you. I think that's very significant. Just just as we don't have any doubt at all that everything that I see is real, what Ramakrishna is saying there is, yes, God is real, but not just as real as this, God is even more real. Now, what does that mean? We are able to understand this idea of more real only when we understand our different experience about waking and dream. When we are dreaming, the dream is very real to us. In the dream, we don't even know we are dreaming. We know a dream to be a dream only when we wake up. And then, of course, when we wake up, then we say, oh, now I'm in the real world. And what I saw last night was only a dream. So our waking world is more real than the dream world. In other words, compared to the waking experience, a dream is only a dream, a shadow, which I can just forget about. Some of the dreams we can't forget, but it's easy to dismiss dream because we know it's not the real world. When we discover that God is more real than this experience we have now, what it implies is that when I recognize or I realize or experience the greater, deeper reality of God, in comparison to that, this world will then appear to be less real. It will become a shadow, almost dreamlike. And so that's the greatest benefit of worship would be that God becomes more real, more and more real. Similarly, just as we can adjust the nature of the hospitality we give to the guests who arrive, depending on the times we have, depending on the circumstances and so on, and also the resources, the same thing can be done in worship as well. So this accords a considerable flexibility in the practice of worship. And as I said, irrespective of the length of the worship and the quantity of offerings, love, devotion, and faith are the most important ingredients. So a lot of the worship that we do here in Boston and in many of the Western centers, some of them are little condensed versions of the worships that are done in other places, especially in India. Some of the Vedanta centers, for instance, the worship of Kali worship that we have in the evenings, or the Shiva worship that we do. In India and some of these places, these go through the entire night. The worship will start around 8:30 at night and go up to 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning. If you want, we can do that here. But the next day, all of you have to go to work. And so we have a... But the important thing is this. The length of the worship, or how elaborately it's done, does not, or the condensed version, the most important thing is the faith and love and devotion through which we do it. It doesn't mean if I do a, say, 12-hour worship, somehow I'm going to get a greater benefit. Because if I'm just feeling drowsy most of the time and just tired and wondering when will this end, then that doesn't help. So these are some of the principles to keep in mind. So God as a divine guest. And so as we look at some of the steps of worship, some of these things will become clear. So while when we actually do the worship on special days here, we don't have any explanations being given. And nor is it expected that everyone understands every little thing that is done, the chanting, etc. But to have some framework in our mind can be helpful to be able to appreciate and participate in the puja more meaningfully. So there are 6 primary steps in the pujas that we do at the Vedanta Center. The first is the preparation. And that involves cleaning of the place, cleaning of the puja vessels, readying them for puja. So it's important to keep in mind when we think about worship, and although we say, oh, the worship will begin at 10:30 in the morning, what is often not, just because of the practicality of it, the worship actually begins much earlier. Earlier with just getting the place cleaned up, washing the vessels, cleaning them, all of this is a part of worship. Although clearly everyone is not just sitting, waiting, and looking at how the vessels are cleaned and all of that. So when we start the worship here, the actual worship has already begun. So the first is preparation. Then of course, when all the things are arranged the way they are arranged, and then when the worshipper sits on the worship seat, and one of the first thing that's done is called, in Sanskrit, they call it achamana. Achamana means purification, because all of the mantras that are going to be chanted will be chanted from the mouth and this thing. So there is a ritual purification of the mouth. And so that's one of the first things. So you'll find the worshipper sometimes taking some water, which is oftentimes mixed with Ganges water, since it's considered very sacred, and then sipping from it and then chanting different mantras. That is for the purification. So there are several things that are done. Then there is a small ritual called sankalpa. Sankalpa means a sacramental intention. And it's something we do in every project we undertake, although we don't think it to be some kind of a ritual. In other words, when we decide to do something, usually, if it's a very focused project, at the start, we say, oh, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I expect for things to happen. And so it's important to make that kind of an intention, and that's something that is done at the beginning of the puja. That why am I even undertaking this practice? What will this practice entail? And what do I hope this practice what benefit it will give? So that sankalpa, the sacramental intention, converts puja into a conscious, self-directed, and goal-oriented discipline. Not just another ritual to be completed, not something that, oh, everyone does, so we are also doing it, but something that is very conscious and goal-oriented. The next is steps. Again, you're not expected to memorize this, just to have a familiarity with what's happening. Then there is a thing called samanya argha, which means consecration of water. Water is one of the main ingredients used in the Vedanta worship. And so that water which is used for worship has to be consecrated. Then in the second steps of puja, there are a series of purifications that are done. And there are actually 5-fold purification. So the main puja is yet to begin. So you clean the place, you start with a series of purifications. So the first is, of course, the purification of the worshipper. So whoever is doing the worship is expected to take shower, wear new clothes or washed clothes. Then there is the purification of worship, which includes cleaning of the place where the worship will occur, decorating it with flowers, incense, and then during the worship, appropriate mantras are chanted. So all this, sometimes you might see me sprinkling water here and there, and that really is ritually sanctifying the place where the worship is being done and so on. Sometimes it just is fine, I'm sprinkling water in the air. So just the area and the space in which the worship is being done, may that be purified as well. Then there is a statement, there is a small ritual called purification of the mantras themselves. And the mantras will be uttered, so there is a certain small ritual for the purification of the utterance of the mantras. Then there is the purification of the ingredients, sprinkling with water all the ingredients that will be used for worship. And finally, there is the sanctification of this whole area, including the altar. And all these are, now from where do these mantras come? These are the mantras that have been formulated which have come down from centuries, right from Vedic and post-Vedic stages. And it has been something, the system that has been followed for God knows how many generations. So it has a very long heritage and history behind it. Then, after all this cleaning and purification of the area is done, then the next step is the divinization of the worshipper. So first of all, there is this practice of pranayama, which is the control of breath, or not control really so much, a rhythmic breathing. Now, pranayama is something that many people, or some people at least, do it as one of their main important parts of their practice. But here in worship, this is something, a requirement for the practice. So it's not, well, people can do it for half an hour, 45 minutes, or whatever time their teacher has asked them to do. In the worship, it's done for a short time as a part of requirement. Then there is an important ritual called Bhuta Shuddhi. Bhuta means the material elements from which this body is made. Body and mind are made. So in Vedanta, they see the body and mind both as material. And so since the worshipper will be doing the worship using both the body and mind, it's important to purify the body and the mind. And so there is a small ritual called Bhuta Shuddhi, purification of the elements that constitute the body and mind. It's a beautiful, I wish there was a little bit more time, maybe some other time we can look at this Bhuta Shuddhi. It's actually a very, very beneficial practice. Maybe sometime in future we can take a deeper look at it. It's like it's almost like reconstructing or rebuilding one's own subtle body. Since in one's heart, we are going to then install the divine, feel the presence of the divine. So wherever we are going to ask the divine guest to be seated, first we need to clean the place. We just can't say, oh, just come and sit. Then after the guests come, okay, wait a minute, let me remove this, dust this place off. Let me bring a vacuuming. We generally want to do that before the guests arrive. And so it's like first reconstruct the heart, purify it, because that's where the divine will be installed. So this is for some future occasion, we can look at a deeper look at Bhuta Shuddhi. And then there is this, a set of rituals called Jiva Nyasa and Kara Anga Nyasa, which really means invoking the divine presence in one's heart, invoking the divine presence in one's own body. Again, a set of mantras that are chanted. And then the fourth step in worship is called invocation and installation. So worship oftentimes involves a double invocation, first in the heart and then in the image. Again, appropriate mantras are chanted when a worshipper, and as I had mentioned on earlier occasions as well, while worship does seem to be, there is an external part to worship. You actually see incense being offered, bell being rung, and that's something very visual, something that we can see and hear. There is a lot going on in the worship inside the mind of the worshipper as well. And that's something only the worshipper knows what's going on. It's a little bit like when you see ducks or geese in the river there, and they sometimes just seem to be just floating very peacefully. It just seems so wonderful. But under the surface of the water, they're vigorously paddling. We don't see what's happening under the water. We just see the top, what's visible above. So similarly, when we attend a worship, we just see what's happening externally. But there is a lot going on internally. In fact, the power of that worship occurs probably more from what is happening in the mind rather than what's happening externally. The two have to be in harmony with each other. So that the installation of the divine, first after done that purification of elements, then the deity that is being worshipped has to be installed ritually in one's own heart. And oftentimes, in many elaborate forms of worship, there is a ritual called prana pratishtha, which means invoking the spirit, invoking the life force inside the image in which that worship is done. So sometimes that's done at the time of Durga Puja or Kali Puja, when they have these big images. That time, actually physically, some mantras are chanted that divine presence is invoked ritually in the image itself. And it's important to keep in mind, at the end of the worship, remember, the beginning of the worship, that divine presence was invoked into that image. At the end of the worship, then the worshipper withdraws that image, the presence in the image, and brings it back into the heart. And that's why then these people are able to take the image and then immerse it into the water. We don't want to immerse a living deity there. The deity's presence is invoked back into the heart. And the next step is this actual service. And that's what normally most people recognize or feel, that that's the puja has begun. And that is when these different offerings are made, just as the things that we offer to the divine guests. And as I said in the beginning, that there is some amount of flexibility there, depending upon the resources, the time, and the context, and so on. So the smallest form of worship, the shortest, which requires minimal thing, is just one offering, and that's just one offering of a flower. Even offering a single flower with faith, devotion, it can be a complete form of worship. But sometimes people have time and they would like to make a more elaborate, so it can be done with one item, with 5 items. So this offering of things is called upachara. And so if it's 5 items, they call it pancha upachara. Pancha means 5. If it's 10 items are offered, then they call it dasha upachara, dashopachara. And then the most elaborate forms of worship that are usually done has 16 items. So they are called shodasha upachara. Again, so there is a lot of flexibility in the worship that can be done. The general pattern in worship is it begins with the worship of the Guru. And that is because it's the Guru that connects a seeker to the divine. So remembering, and this has been a standard practice in the time of prayer, worship, and meditation. First, to remember the teacher who connects us to the divine. So first is the worship of the Guru. Then there is a worship of what are called the 5 deities or 5 forms of the divine. Now, why these 5 forms? Now, clearly, as many of you are already familiar, that there is a tradition in Vedanta that freedom to think of the divine in a way that comes naturally to us. So at the time this system got formulated, there were at least 5 major forms of deities that had followers. And they included Shiva, Surya, the sun, the brightest object known to us was a symbol of that light. So Shiva, Surya, then Narayana or Vishnu, Ganesha, of course, and then Devi, Durga. And so, as is natural with human nature, when I'm worshipping a certain form of the divine, and then you find some other people worshipping some other forms of the divine, human beings are like, whether should I be doing this or should I be doing that? Is this better? That is better. Which is much stronger? So people then keep on arguing, and then sects and kind of this narrow-mindedness kind of can grow. Everyone trying to think of their own thing as the best, and somehow denigrating or looking down upon other forms of worship. So seeing that variety, and so that people should be reminded as often as possible that no matter in which form and which name we worship the divine, God is one, the divine is one. And so to remove that kind of fanaticism from the heart, so there is this system that no matter which principal deity one is worshipping, in the beginning one has to worship all these other deities as well. Because that's a way of reminding ourselves that it's the same divine that appears and manifests in many different forms, many different ways, and even as formless. So worshipping not only just these 5, but also whatever other forms of deities that one would like to remember at that point. And then we come to that, the principal deity. By principal deity is meant whichever is the main, and oftentimes depending on the specific occasion, the principal deity can change. And as we have had now already up to this point, we had the Durga Puja, the Devi as Durga, the Devi as Kali. Now will be upcoming next month will be the worship of Sharda Devi, then Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, Shiva, many different. So depending on the occasion, there'll be this one main worship, but all these other worships are done before that main worship begins. And that worship, as I have said, can have either one item, 5, 10, 16, depending on the elaborateness of that worship. And finally, after all these things are done, the worship concludes with a prayer and a spirit of surrender. And the concluding prayer is very, very interesting in the sense that the worshipper then not only seeks forgiveness, because no matter how well you do it, there's some imperfections will remain, and it's a recognition that unknowingly or unconsciously, if I've done something not correctly or something was not done well, to seek the forgiveness, that I'll try to be more mindful in the future and please forgive if I have made any mistakes. But among the mistakes that can also be made, and there is this beautiful prayer which says that one of the mistakes in any form of worship would be that I have ascribed form to the divine who is beyond form and beyond formlessness. I've tried to think of given a name to the divine in some way, but I should also recognize that the divine is really beyond all ideas, beyond all names. And this is important to keep that in mind, because the general kind of a rather superficial understanding of worship is, oh, that's something dualistic thing. I'm a non-dualist. I don't believe in worship. But if we go through this whole process, the puja is done in the Vedanta societies, it'll be very difficult to call it either dualistic or non-dualistic. It just sees the harmony, even while recognizing that the ultimate reality, the divine, is beyond form, beyond name, beyond any idea. But recognizing that in my present state, if I have to find a way and open a bridge of communication, because my form is real to me right now, it is easier for me to think of God in a specific form. Because my mind thinks in terms of concepts and ideas, I'm using concepts and ideas to get in touch with that divine, while all the time never forgetting that God is beyond concepts, beyond ideas, beyond forms. And then sometimes we do, usually, as you may be aware, that we do an arati, a waving of lights after the worship, and that sometimes gets considered as if just a part of the larger worship, and which it is, but just the waving of lights itself is a complete worship in itself. Again, that's something we can try to, if you want to look at it a little bit more deeply, because sometimes you'll find on special days, it's not just the lights that are waved. We have a conch with the water in it, there is a cloth, and there is a flower. All of these things have a deeper meaning behind it. So again, something left for a future discussion. And finally, what about participation in puja? Because clearly when puja can be done individually, clearly, all of us, there is no restriction to doing worship to anyone. Everyone is eligible to do worship. So we can do it individually, but oftentimes it's also done collectively, as when we come to a Vedanta center and we gather together and do puja. So when we do puja as a group, how can we participate in it? So first is to kind of get rid of the idea that, well, usually at the Vedanta Center, I'm the one who is sitting here and doing it. So not to think that, oh, the Swami is doing puja. Yes and no. Yes and no, because everyone who participates in the puja is actually doing the puja also. It's possible to do it. So participation is not simply sitting and watching it and figuring out what's going on now, or just enjoying it. But it's possible to feel that I'm a part of the puja, that I'm doing the puja. So those who, in some ways, contributing to the puja in some way, even bringing or helping bring the ingredients required for puja, oftentimes, of course, clearly, fruits, flowers, and whichever way we can contribute to the puja in some way, that is not simply helping in the puja, actually, that is a part of the puja itself. We saw that preparation of the puja is a part of the puja. So, those who help in some way in preparing for the puja are doing the puja as well. The other way we can participate is really what it's like doing puja vicariously, if you like. Uh, the one who may be sitting at the seat and before the altar and doing puja is not doing it for that person alone. That person is representing the entire congregation who is participating. And therefore, everyone present at the puja gets a benefit of that worship. Sometimes when we go to watch the game and in Fenway or basketball or football or wherever we go, and there are people who are very devoted to a certain game. Now they themselves may not, some of them people may play those games themselves, but not everyone can. But people can sometimes be so much involved when they go to watch a game, and they might have a favorite player doing so. Why is it that we enjoy it so much? Or why is it that if a certain player doesn't play well on a certain day, we're so disappointed and we can even get so upset about it? Oftentimes that's because we play the game ourselves vicariously. There is someone there on the field playing, and when I'm immersed in that puja, and I'm watching that, for a moment, when you're just immersed in that, you forget that you're just watching it. You are as if playing the game yourself through that your favorite player. And that's why we are so emotionally affected, one way or the other, by the outcome of the game. That's a very good analogy. So we do a lot of things vicariously, something that we may not do through this body and mind, but we kind of see that happening by someone else doing it. When we go to a collective puja done as a group, that's something important to remember, that everyone is just free. Not that I'm just sitting and watching the puja, but get so immersed in the puja that yes, I'm not physically sitting there and doing these things, but whoever is doing it, and my whole attention is there, and it is as if I'm doing it. So we can get the benefit of doing the puja ourselves. So we should stop thinking that I'm just watching the puja or seeing the puja, and change it to that this act of forgetting myself and being immersed in the spirit of worship gives the same benefit as actually physically doing the puja oneself. Also, one of the things that we do at the puja here, the worship here, is whenever there is offerings made, fruits and food and so on, and that time it's very customary for the one who is doing worship to do a japa. And the idea is that once you make this offering of food or fruits chanting appropriate mantras, you are expected to japa in the mind with the visualization that the deity whichever deity that food is being offered, that deity is coming and accepting that offering. Now that's something everyone can do. So, of course, if one can do japa all throughout the worship itself, but especially during the time of offering, if we do that japa oneself and with that awareness that this food that is being offered is being received by the divine, and that kind of japa is also a part of doing worship. And finally, of course, joining in music, singing, and doing that with faith and devotion is also part of doing puja. And finally, among all of these things, making a special effort to feel the presence of God, both in one, not only at the altar, but also in one's own heart. And so a puja, a worship, even when done in a group setting, can be immensely beneficial to every one of us individually. So to the extent we are able to feel the presence of God in our heart and in the environment in which we are, we can derive immense benefit from worship. So these are some of the things I thought I would share with you today, some of the basic principles of worship and the general structure, the form of worship that it is done. So the next time we have worship here, I hope you will remember a few of these things and derive a greater benefit from that worship as well. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhur.